So yeah, welcome everyone. As Sampath said, my name is Alex Bond. I'm the principal curator and curator in charge of birds at the Natural History Museum. And the title of my talk is a bit tongue-in-cheek. We've called it Rothschild's Legacy. Walter Rothschild was a very important scientist in the UK in the early 20th century. And our existence here, not quite in London, but about 50 kilometers outside the city, is basically his fault. So what I will do is, there we go. I'll talk a little bit about the history of the NHM. I'll talk about how we've used birds in galleries and exhibitions, specifically the Natural History Museum at Tring, which is where I'm based and where the bird collection is based. We'll talk a little bit about the collections that we have here. As Sampath said, they're fairly extensive. We have 1 million bird objects. Across the museum, we have about 100 million objects spanning everything from meteorites to herbarium sheets, to birds, to giant squid, to butterflies, and everything in between. I'll talk a little bit about how that data is made accessible around the world, and then wrap up with some of the research that I and some of my colleagues here at the museum are doing, and then we'll have some time for questions. So our foundation at the NHM, we can trace back to the British Museum. So we were formerly part of the British Museum, which opened in 1759 at Montague House in Bloomsbury, which is in London. And this was the amalgamation of two collections. First was the Irish doctor, Sir Hans Sloane, who died in 1753, and the Library of King George II. And those two collections coming together essentially formed the British Museum. Now, there's not a lot of material in the bird side of things that survive from that period, but we do have a couple of examples. So we know Sloane had more than 1,000 bird specimens from around the world. Of those, I believe there's only about 2 that are left, both skulls of hornbills, like this rhinoceros hornbill here. In the mid-1800s, room at Montague House was rapidly running out, a challenge faced by museums everywhere, even today. And it was replaced by a new building, which is still used today, designed by architect Robert Smirke in the sort of the neo-classic style. And this is currently the home of the British Museum. Now, at the time, the British Museum encompassed everything, which today is the Natural History Museum, the British Library, and the British Museum. And so they decided in the 1880s that the natural history departments would get their own space. So we moved into a brand new building built by Alfred Waterhouse in South Kensington, which is not too far away, maybe 5 or 6 kilometers, purpose-built, and that's where we're still based today. And this was designed with Waterhouse, with the input of Richard Owen, who was our first keeper of natural history, well, one of the early keepers of natural history. And he designed it to be essentially, as he called it, a cathedral of nature. So we've got massive vaulted ceilings, specimens created in that central hall, almost as an index of the natural world, spread across 3 floors, countless galleries, and has undergone a whole variety of changes in terms of the exhibitions that have been there. In 1963, the British Museum Natural History, as we were known, we formally became independent from the BM, and about 30 years ago, we officially changed our name to the Natural History Museum, as opposed to British Museum Natural History. And you can see, yeah, this is the original concept drawing of the ground floor. And you can see sort of in the bottom left, just here, a huge section devoted to birds. This is the bird gallery. So the way that Waterhouse designed the building was essentially living things was on the east side, or the west side, excuse me, and the dead things were on the right. So that was, fossils, minerals, and that sort of thing. But obviously a huge bias towards vertebrate collections, because at the time that was what would draw people in. So we had our bird galleries there on the ground floor, just to the left as you went in that big impressive front door. And then sometime about the 1950s, the birds up and moved over to the other side. And galleries have shifted here and there all over the place. So that strict separation between sort of living on one side and dead on the other no longer really applies. During the Second World War, obviously London was bombed quite heavily, and the museum was not spared this. So we suffered quite a bit of damage over a few nights during the Blitz in 1940. And you can see here one of the security keepers picking up an Arctic tern from a glass display case that had been shattered. Our most recent development in the galleries is called Life in the Air, which is a combination of 3 panels. We've got pheasants and chickens and their allies. We've got tube-nosed seabirds, and we've got some amazing macaws in flight. And again, much like Owen's original galleries, there's very little interpretation. It's meant to draw people in and guide them to things further behind in the collections. And of course, we've got the bird gallery today, which covers a whole variety of groups. We've got a section on birds of prey, a section on extinct and endangered species. We have examples of all 38 orders of birds on display, as well as cases describing breeding, reproduction, nests and eggs, and some birds of the South American rainforest. The museum is free to enter. It has been for about 20 years, much thanks to a grant and aid from the UK government, as with all the national museums. But that's London, and we'll leave London for a moment, and we'll travel, like I said, about 50 kilometers north to the small country town of Tring. This is the Rothschild building. This was Rothschild's original museum, founded in 1892, and contains galleries much in the same way that he designed. The original casing, a lot of the original specimens as well, and again, that very quintessentially Victorian natural history design, lots and lots of specimens with very minimal interpretation. Now, Rothschild was a fan of birds, but also butterflies in particular. So there's a couple of very poor newspaper clippings showing the old building that used to be here at Tring, adjacent to the public galleries. And this was what held his Lepidoptera collection, his butterflies and moths. And this was demolished in the 1960s to make way for the building that I'm speaking to you from today, which is the ornithology building. We've got 4 floors of specimens covering, I don't know how many square feet, 60,000 drawers, 2,500 cabinets. And to sort of place us in the British context, you can see London there in the bottom right, Oxford, if you're familiar with Oxford, sort of in the top left, and Tring sort of there in the middle. It's about an hour from London on the train. And so I've alluded to it a little bit, but why are the birds in this small little market town in Tring? Population about 12,000. And it comes down to this fellow here. This is Walter Rothschild of the famous Rothschild family. He did not want to be a politician, although he was an MP for a few years. He didn't want to be a banker. He was a collector. And at the age of 21, he was essentially gifted a museum by the family. He opened public galleries in 1892. And on his death in 1937, the museum and its contents passed to the British nation under the care of the British Museum, Natural History, now the NHM. His entomology collection moved to South Kensington in London, to our main site, and the bird collection originally that was moved down there to combine with the national collection was moved back to Tring in the 1970s. And it's important to realize Rothschild's own personal collection, which at the time of just before his death, was about 300,000 specimens, the largest private collection in the world. Only about 5 to 10% of that is here in Tring. And that's because in the 1930s, he ran into financial troubles and had to sell his collection. And the British Museum, realizing that he would gift the collection to the nation on his death, declined to purchase it. And it was therefore purchased by the American Museum of Natural History. So most of Rothschild's collection is actually sitting in New York. And Tring has a long history, ironically, of ornithological research. So Rothschild and his first curator of birds, Ernst Hartert, there on the left. It was also the first home for the British Trust for Ornithology, who moved from the Bird Room in South Kensington out to Tring to their own facility in the 1970s, and they're now based in Norfolk. It was also the home of the British Ornithologists Union, the BOU, up until about 2000. They maintained an office here. So there's a long history of bird research and organization in this small little town. So what does the bird group look like today? We're pretty lucky. We've got a really great, wonderful, amazing team. So this is myself as the curator in charge. We've got 2 curators that look after our skin collection. So that's Mark Adams and Hein van Grauw. We've got 2 curators who look after our anatomical collections. So that's Spirit, alcohol preserved specimens, and also the skeleton collection in Judy White and Joe Cooper. And we've got Douglas Russell, who's our curator of birds, eggs, and nests. We're lucky as well to have 2 postdoctoral fellows, Joby and Martin, who are here on EU Marie Curie funded fellowships. And we've got Claire Atkinson, who will be joining us actually in just a couple of weeks again as a curatorial assistant with a focus on specimen digitization. Right, so the good stuff. What do we actually help look after? These are examples of all of, well, not even all, most of the kinds of things that we have here in the collection. So on the top right, we've got five skins. These are birds that have been skinned. Their insides have been taken out. They're stuffed with cotton wool. But the feathers, as long as they're kept in good environmental conditions, will maintain and be unchanged for, well, as we know now, hundreds of years. We've got a very large nest collection. So there's a nest of a bioweaver there at the top. A fluid preserved specimen there, an egg, that's from the extinct great auk from the North Atlantic that went extinct in 1844. And we've got a very large skeletal or osteological collection. So what I'll do is I'll walk you through each of these collections and talk a little bit about them. In terms of size, we're probably the largest bird collection on the planet. We're certainly the most diverse in terms of species. We cover 95% of all species in our skin collection. There's about 12,000 species of birds in the world. And that's 70,000 objects, about 20,000 skeletons, about 20,000 spirit alcohol specimens, probably close to 300,000 eggs, mostly British and from the Western Palearctic. The largest collection of birds' nests in the world, just over 4,000. We've got about 4,000 mounted birds. These are used in exhibitions and galleries. And we have a rapidly increasing tissue collection, which we started establishing more than 20 years ago for the use in molecular studies. And when did we get these sort of things? Most of the collection that we have here is from about 1850 to 1950. So you can see there, that's sort of the history of acquisitions, the number of specimens acquired each year. And you can see some really massive peaks. So this is the Salvin and Godman collection, which was about 60,000 specimens that came in from Osbert Salvin and Frederick Duquesne Godman in the late 1880s. This is the Rothschild collection here. This is the collection of Richard Meinertzhagen and the collection from Norwich Castle Museum. So you can see, a huge variety. Now, as with any collection, I think it's fair to say in the British Isles, most of this was accomplished through vast networks of colonial officers and scientists who would send things back. So the skin collection, probably our most heavily used collection. This is often what you think about when you think of museum specimens. 70,000 specimens, again, covering 95% of the world's birds. Of type specimens, these are the specimens used to describe new species or subspecies. We've got the largest in the world for birds, more than 10,000. We have a significant collection of extinct and globally endangered specimens. And as I said, about 4,000 mounts. And in terms of how this compares across the world, we're probably top two between us and the American Museum of Natural History in New York, who has a comparable collection. We have a greater focus on obviously former British colonial possessions, East Asia, South Asia, and Africa, and Australasia, whereas the AMNH has a larger focus on the South Pacific Islands and the Neotropics, and much more recent collection than one we have. In terms of taxonomic diversity, we cover all 38 orders, all 237 families, 95% of species from worldwide, and we've got some really important historic specimens. So we have thousands of specimens from Alfred Russel Wallace. We have Charles Darwin's, some of Charles Darwin's birds, including actual Darwin's finches, as well as collections from Captain Fitzroy from the Beagle, John James Audubon from the Americas, Augustus Hume particularly from Asia. Many of these sort of historic Antarctic expeditions, Shackleton, Scott, Ross, the names that are often associated now with geographic features. We're a very heavily used collection. We welcome anyone who has a genuine research interest and need to use the collection. That includes scientists, artists, historians, because they're not just, scientific objects, they're historical objects as well. So people looking to to study people or places or histories of collectors often come and use the collection as well. And we get about 200 a year for between 400 and 600 visitor days. And this is obviously pre-pandemic, although I will say it is rapidly increasing again. And we deal with a huge volume of email inquiries, probably between 2,000 and 3,000 over the course of the year. The strengths of the collection really lie in its size, its breadth, and its depth. If you want to study something across the avian radiation and you want to do it in one place, this is probably the place to do it. We've got global geographic coverage, our huge collection of types, and probably one of the largest collection of extinct and endangered specimens in the world. And I should say that the taxa that are extinct and endangered, none of these are attributable to museum collecting, much more likely to be from things like habitat loss, introduced species, or human persecution. In terms of our weaknesses, though, we lack a lot of modern material. So the important thing about museums and the way they can be used, one is obviously the breadth of taxa present, but also is time series within a taxon. So if you take a common species like the European blackbird, I can tell you lots about European blackbirds from the 1880s, the 1920s, even the 1950s. But if you want to study European blackbirds from the 1990s for some reason, we won't have that many specimens because the assumption is, oh, you've got plenty already. You don't need more. We don't actively go out and collect. Most of the work that we do involves receiving specimens from members of the public. A bird dies in somebody's garden, or from researchers who have mortalities in the field or come across specimens in the field. There's a focus in birds, sort of generally, to focus on breeding plumage males. So we have lower coverage of females and juvenile and immature plumages. Most of the specimens we have are skins. Once they're dried, you can't do things like spread out the wings to look at wing feathers. So, or look at, sample tissues. So that becomes a bit of a challenge if people want to do that. And the important thing to remember is of these 700,000 specimens, only about 70 to 75,000 of these have been databased. We know they exist. We have our paper registers, but in terms of quickly searching what do we have, it often involves a trip over to the collections cabinets rather than querying a database. And that's simply the sheer volume of material that we have. We've got a couple of important and really exciting research projects. University of Sheffield doing some work across the birds, looking at bill shape diversity, and plumage evolution. BirdLife International, which is the IUCN Red List Authority for birds, they regularly make use of our collection, particularly for reviewing proposed taxonomic changes. Going on at the moment, as I said, we've got University of Sheffield doing a lot of work here. They're in, I think, year about 8 of that project. The curators here, we all do some research around plumage aberrations, plastic ingestion, Wallace's expeditions in the Amazon. We cover external researchers and their interest in taxonomy and systematics. So whether that's speciation or new country records or delineating taxa. Conservation, looking at population declines or splitting isolated populations for conservation purposes. And we do a lot of molecular work. So we will do some destructive sampling of tissues for molecular work. And the stuff that we've, a couple of examples here. So we've got some rails here. So one of our researchers is studying the evolution of flightness in rails. We've had external researchers looking at the reintroduction of capercaillie, which is a large grouse in Scotland, formerly native to Britain, but extirpated in the early 1800s, reintroduced from Scandinavia. And we contributed, massively to the Handbook of the Birds of the World and its revisions. Right, looking at the anatomical collections, as I said, about 20,000 objects. A lot of those are complete. Some of them will be incomplete. So for skeletons, that might be a skull or just a sternum or a particular element. For spirit, that might be, for example, internal organs. A large proportion of these, we only have a few examples of. So you can see we've got less than 10% of our objects or specimens with more than 10 complete examples. And this starts to limit how we can do things in terms of loaning materials or offering them up for exhibitions. In terms of strengths, we've got really great coverage at the family level and not so bad at genus. I think we cover, about a third of the genera of the world. The skeleton collection, we're regularly adding between 5 and 10 new taxa every year. And that's from backlogs in freezers to donations from members of the public. We've got particularly large collections from the UK, obviously, but also Australia, Malaysia, Brazil, and Africa. And that reflects single large donations that have come in or exchanges with other institutions. We've got material going back hundreds of years. Our oldest spirit specimen is from Cook's second voyage in 1778. And as I said, our oldest skeleton specimens are from Hans Sloane's original collection, which was donated in 1753. In the spirit collection, we've got quite a few unique or rare taxa in terms of spirit specimens. So specimens that don't exist in spirit elsewhere. The difference between a spirit collection and a skin collection is obviously in the spirit collection, it's the whole bird. So it's all the internal organs, it's all the integument, it's absolutely everything. So if you're interested in any of that, and this was formerly used mostly for anatomical studies, but with advances in things like CT scanning, this collection is getting more and more use. We've got in the skeleton collection in particular, a really great coverage of pathological specimens. And this is probably because a lot of the skeleton specimens that we have are formerly from captivity. In terms of some of our challenges, we've got, particularly among the passerines, the perching birds, which is about half the radiation of birds, 6,000 species. We've got relatively low coverage. We lack the depth that some of the other collections have in terms of the number of specimens in many taxa. And that not only restricts how you can compare things within species, but our ability, as I said, to loan those out for research. For many specimens, particularly the older ones, we lack the provenance data, and we have an absolutely massive backlog of unprocessed specimens, like you can see there on the left. We skeletonize our material using dermestid beetle colonies, flesh-eating beetles, but that takes a long time, and we have a lot to get through, which is why we're still adding so many new taxa every year. In terms of the research themes that we have ongoing here, a lot of it is archaeological and paleontological, so identifying material. We've got particular interest in the team right now in North Africa and the Middle East. In terms of students and visitors, again, a lot of material going out for CT scanning. Because we are such a large collection, we get a lot of folks coming in to look at identifying material from archaeological excavations, looking at osteopathology or development. The egg collection. So we have a Twitter account if you're into Twitter, NHM Oology. More than 200,000 clutches, half the world's bird species, and about 4,000 nests. It's probably the biggest collection of avian breeding specimens, breeding biology specimens in the world. It's got quite a few strengths and weaknesses. The egg collection is huge. It's data rich, lots of data, because it's very difficult to tie a label on an egg. If you're quite curious, try it at home. So a lot of the information is captured in manuscripts and on data cards. We've got very good coverage of Western Palearctic and former British colonial areas. The manuscripts that go along with these are a huge resource of information. And we can start to link that with things like the BTO and their nest record scheme, which looks at particularly British breeding birds. As with the rest of the collection, a lot of the collection is late 1800s, early 1900s. We don't have very good coverage in some areas like the Nearctic and the Neotropical. But that also matches up with sort of our current gaps of our understanding of avian breeding biology. The nests collection is probably the biggest in the world, 4,000, half the families, and about a third of the genera. A huge number, more than 130 extinct and endangered nests. And when you think about particularly extinct animals, this is the manifestation of behavior. And so capturing this behavior in this way, I think, is something that's really quite underappreciated. And is very humbling when you're looking at a nest of an extinct species. We're seeing more and more use of this, looking at nest architecture, animal cognition. But again, it's relatively unknown and largely untapped. In the nest collection, unlike some of the others, we have amazing coverage in the passerines, but less so in the non-passerines. So only 16% of our collection represents non-passerines, and those are taxonomically represent about 50% of bird species. And lastly, the collection that I'm increasingly excited about is our tissue collection in our molecular collections facility. This is a cross-museum initiative. We've got liquid nitrogen tanks and -80 freezers. And this means that we can take tissues from new preparations, quickly freeze them and make them available for high quality genomic studies. So we're partnered with the Darwin Tree of Life, which is aiming to sequence all life in the British Islands, which is quite ambitious. But at the moment, people requesting molecular material, we have to destructively sample from usually one of the skin specimens from the toe pad. But by expanding that to include frozen tissues, not only will they get better genomes, but the specimens will remain much more intact. So digitization, this is one of the biggest challenges that we have in the museum. And it's one that I think we struggle with more than a lot of smaller collections, and that's simply because of size. So the NHM as a whole has 100 million, objects. In birds, we have 1 million, and only about 15% of that exists digitally. So that's all material that we've registered after 1994. And our main questions when we look about digitizing things is, what is it? Where was it from? Who collected it and when? And the challenge is you've got to work within a system that can accommodate absolutely everything. So I've got two examples here of labels that we would see on bird skin. So the one on the left there, you can see it's got a drawing. It's got, it's non-standard format. It's got notes about color, writing on every different angle. Nothing is captured systematically, but all the information is still there. So turning a specimen into a digital record actually takes a lot more time. It's like painting a room. The majority of your time is invested in getting the specimen ready to be digitized. So that's, ensuring that the label is attached, 1, ensuring that it's registered, 2, and if it isn't, figuring out if it had been registered 100 years before. Because the collection is so old, we have these historic anomalies and other challenges. Making sure you know what that specimen actually is in present day taxonomy. making sure you know where that collection came from. We have, as a colonial collection, we have so many specimens with labels that have colonial names or just imperfect names or incorrect names for where they were collected. Those all have to be resolved before they can be properly databased. That said, when things are databased, they'll appear on the NHM data portal. This is free to access. Anyone can use and download. Data.nhm.ac.uk. You see we've got about 10 million objects on there at present, so about 10% across the museum. We've also got a separate types database for birds specifically. And if anyone has any questions at all about any of the specimens, the easiest thing to do is to email us at bird-inquiries@nhm.ac.uk. And then it'll get to the appropriate researcher, because, as I said, with only 10 to 15% of the collection online, anything that you pull out there will by definition be incomplete. So that's the specimen side of things. In terms of research, we're incredibly lucky. We've got an incredibly diverse array of folks here doing research, both in the course of their curatorial jobs, but also as researchers. So here's a couple of examples. This is just from the last year or so. So we've got a review of environmental specimen banks and their use in monitoring environmental contamination. A paper that I wrote with some colleagues of mine looking at changes in egg size in albatross species. Hein has written about Theodore Lorenz, who was an important taxidermist and collector in Moscow in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Nigel Collar, one of our scientific associates, publishes an annual review of taxonomic changes in Asian birds. One that I'm particularly excited about, Joe Cooper recently put out the category F British list. So these are fossil, fossil type specimens and subfossil type specimens recorded in Britain. And that's the culmination of years and years and years of work. Judy's been involved in some work at the WF16 site in southern Jordan, identifying primarily birds of prey. Robert Priest-Jones, again, one of our researchers, scientific associates, doing collections-based research. We found an incredibly old imperial woodpecker skeleton, which had gone overlooked for quite some time. And then contributing to broader reviews, a group including Miguel Marini, who's actually here visiting today, including our curator Douglas Russell, did a review of the 5 million eggs in museum collections worldwide and how they can be used. We do modern field work, so we've got pictures here. This is Atlanticia rogersi in the top left. That's the smallest flightless bird in the world, the inaccessible rail, which is the focus of Martin Stovander's research. On the right, that's WF16. That's where Judy's been involved in some work. And in the bottom, a couple of photographs of me in the field doing some work on Lord Howe Island, looking at plastic pollution, and Henderson Island in the South Pacific Ocean, looking at invasive species and their effect on birds. Our two postdocs, Martin and Joby. So Martin is looking at the evolution of, well, not just flightlessness, but a whole bunch of other things, including the rapid radiation of these 4 finches, buntings, cardinals. We're really not sure what the heck they are, from the Tristan da Cunha Islands in the South Atlantic Ocean. And then on the bottom right, that's a photograph from Joby, who's looking at the physical and chemical properties of some of the plastics that we find in seabirds and what that might mean for them. So he's been photographing and analyzing and measuring them. So, huge array, diverse, research interests, the collection as well. So with that, I'll wrap up. I'll say thanks to everyone involved in the bird group, in the NHM Science Division, and particularly our colleagues in Library and Archives, with whom we work sort of cheek by jowl. I'll wrap up and say thank you. If anyone has any questions, I'm happy to answer them. Otherwise, you can contact me at my email address there or on Twitter. So yeah, amazing. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Alex. That's awesome. And very, very thought-provoking and really good insights about the collection and what we can do with it, I assume. Thanks, Alex. Thanks for your time. So what we can do, we'll have the question and answer session now. The audience can ask questions directly from Dr. Alex Bond, or as well as you can use the chat box. It's up to you, but yeah, it's open for the audience. Feel free to ask questions. We have, Alex, we have students. We have fourth year, third year level major students of zoology, molecular biology, immunology, environment science kind of backgrounds, as well as I can see the first year and second year biology students are there as well. As well as the faculty members, including the head of the department, Professor Preeti Udagama, she was there as well. Anyway, audience, so yeah, the podium is open for questions.
There's a couple in the chat. We can maybe start there.
Yeah. Shall we? You want to? Shall I relay that to you?
Yeah, go ahead.
How do you store eggs in Natural History Museum? Are only the shells stored or entire egg?
So most of the eggs are just the shells. Obviously, if you leave an egg out, it will go off and it will smell terrible. So most of the eggs that we have are just the shells. You can store whole eggs, including the contents, in the spirit collection, and we have a small number of those, but the majority are just the shells.
Let's see. The associated, there's two more questions in the same chat. How do you keep the nest materials intact when storing them? That's the second question. I think it's a very tricky one. The third one is what is the extent of Sri Lankan collection at the National History Museum?
So on nests, yeah, that's a really amazing question, because that's something we still struggle with. Any handling of a nest is inherently destructive. So we try and minimize handling as much as we can. Items are stored in individual boxes, and sometimes we don't even take them out of the box, depending on what's being asked. But yeah, that's a huge consideration when we're looking at requests for access to the nest collection, because they are very fragile, and some of them quite old. Our oldest nest is probably about 200 years old. Yeah, incredibly fragile bits of material. The extent of the Sri Lankan collection, I wish I knew. This is one of those things that, once the collection is entirely digitized, then we can relatively easily answer that. I suspect it's going to be, I don't know. It's probably going to be reasonably significant because of, the former colonial links with Britain. But I think, we also have huge collections from India. So whether that will obviously dwarf any collections we've got from Sri Lanka. But yeah, do not know. But I'm, as Sampath, as you and I know from some of our work on plovers, there's definitely material here, old material from the 1860s and 70s and 80s from British rule.
I'll add that, Alex. So these, at least when it comes to plovers, the legs collection, Holdsworth collection from Arippu Mana area, Hambantota area, the specimens are there. Leg collection, some of the most extensive collections of birds from Sri Lanka. Half of it went to the Natural History Museum collections, and then the weights collection mostly went to Calcutta. And some of the legs collections went to Tasmania, and later some went back to British Museum. So these are from our records, from the records of the National History Museum of Colombo's records. So there have been quite a bit of movement, especially Lawton, Layard, then leg and weight. Phillips's collections are there. I know even there's one Mimina mouse deer is in the UBC collection in Vancouver from Sri Lanka, from Phillips. So there's been quite a bit of movement of specimens, material from Sri Lanka to the West. So I'm quite, by what we saw in plovers, they are there. So yeah, so I'm pretty sure the representation would be higher for the endemics and some of the more charismatic real tropical forms when it comes to the collecting. Yeah, over to you, Alex. There were some other questions in the chat box. How you disinfect bird nests before final preservation?
So every institution does things a little bit differently, but we operate on a system of integrated pest management, which means we don't use pesticides or herbicides in the collection. What we do is we keep those environments pest-free through behaviors. So we don't eat or drink in collections. We don't let people bring their own bags in. They've got to bring things in a plastic bag that we provide. When all material comes into the museum, it's immediately frozen for 2 weeks in a giant walk-in freezer at -20 degrees, and that will eliminate any pathogens or vertebrates or insects, or anything. So that's true for every specimen, regardless of whether it's the first time coming into the museum or it's been out on exhibition or anything going into a collections area. The first stop is the freezer for 2 weeks.
I see. So in that light, for the if a specimen get like being loaned to another institute, study skin, would that also went into this freezer, Alex, before getting it back to the collection?
Yes. So, and yeah, stuff that's been on tour, in exhibitions and galleries, or specimens that have been loaned and are coming back. Yeah, everything goes into the freezer for 2 weeks before we bring it back in.
By the way, in that light, like if somebody visiting, say, UK, what is the procedure of visiting the research collection? Like I'm asking this for the purpose of the audience here. Yeah,
the best thing to do is to get in touch with us by email. So bird-inquiries@nhm.ac.uk, so that we can discuss your research needs, whether we can accommodate it. Visiting the collection is by appointment only, but as long as you've got a valid scientific need and you've got the right paperwork. So if you're a student, that involves a letter from your supervisor, photo ID, that sort of thing, then we'll arrange a visit. But yeah, as long as you've got a valid reason to come in and look at the collection, other than I just think birds are neat. I mean, that's lovely, and we all think birds are neat, but a valid research need, then we'll do our best to accommodate it. It can be challenging. I appreciate getting to the UK. There's a couple of grant opportunities. One is called Synthesis, which is an EU-funded program for collections access across 13 countries in Europe, including the UK. The last round of transnational access requests just closed, but I'm hoping that they will be renewing that for another round. So if anyone is interested in visiting the collections, not just the bird collections, but any of these collections, I encourage you to check that out.
Great. And there's a whole lot of questions here. So there's another one, Alex. It says, may I know whether there is a collection of bird calls in the Natural History Museum?
Bird calls, recordings of calls, and photographs is a really interesting gray area. So as a rule, we don't. In the UK, there's the British Sound Archive, which sort of looks after that, but not really, because it's sort of natural history. So for bird calls, we usually encourage people to get in touch with the Macaulay Lab at Cornell University, which is a global repository for bird recordings. So we don't specialize or have anything in particular relating to bird calls.
Yeah. And then, so anyway, to answer that, there's a Macaulay Library. Cornell University has a fairly extensive archive, and it's linked to eBird now. So if you use eBird, or if you wanted to upload natural sound, not just bird sound, any natural sound, you can archive it in Cornell Lab of Ornithology, Macaulay Library. Anyway, I guess so. It's more broader, I guess, in that way, right? And there's another specific question, Alex, again in the chat box. How's your collection helping Tristan albatross, which is a critically endangered bird, sadly declining in populations?
Yeah, I'm incredibly lucky to have worked with Tristan Albatross for a number of years. The collection here, I don't think has been directly involved in any of the conservation action around Tristan Albatross. Their main threats are longline fishing and introduced mice at their main breeding site on Gough Island. We do work with the Royal Society for Protection of Birds, who is the group that's looking after the eradication. And they have very generously donated some specimens to us from some of their field work. So in a sense, they're supporting us and we're providing a home for some of those specimens. But in terms of direct conservation action for Tristan Albatross, the collection, I'm afraid, in this case, isn't very much use.
I'm Preeti. So it was extremely interesting, and I'm an immunologist, but thanks, Alex, for this fabulous presentation. I got very excited. I'm sure Sampath would have told you that I'm coming on the phone because I'm having a power cut right now. We have a museum which must be pretty old because our department is 100 years old, Sampath.
Correct. Yeah.
And I'm just, I mean, this is not science. I'm going to ask you, so I don't know that this
That's
is
okay.
Appropriate question. No, Alex, could you recommend a few places where we could tap in for funding to sort of renovate and refurbish and sort of get the whole thing going again? Your advice on that?
Yeah, I mean, that's incredibly tricky. I think probably the best thing, there's no real international organization that funds museums. Museums are usually funded by state, local, or regional governments.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, we are happy to provide advice and guidance, and we can certainly provide training. But again, that comes with some sort of cost. The challenge, yeah, is, and there are so many museums in the global south that have faced these challenges.
Mm-hmm.
And I think probably the best thing is to tap into the community of global collections, whether that's through email lists, which are quite active, particularly in Europe, or professional organizations like the International Committee for Museums. Those are the ones who are going to start to provide some networking, because I think that's where your best bet for building those relationships and hopefully securing some funding is going to come from.
Okay, right. I'm sorry to have embarrassed you, but this is a very genuine question, coming from the heart, because we really want to. I mean, Sampath is, in charge and doing the best he can, but as the head of the department, I'm, compelled to ask such questions. So please forgive me. Anyway, thank you so much, and it was really nice listening to you. Thank you for the fantastic presentation. Thank you.
It's my pleasure. And yeah, as I said, as I was saying to Sampath earlier, I would absolutely adore to come look at the collection that you have in Colombo. It sounds like it's absolutely amazing. And yeah, if there's bits of advice that we can provide from afar by email, I think as the Natural History Museum, I think we've got a bit of an obligation to help out, because we are comparatively so well supported. The fact that we have 6 curators of birds is unheard of anywhere else in the world. We're incredibly lucky. And I think it's our job to leverage that for the benefit of museum collections worldwide.
Yes, thanks, Alex. And in that same light, I want to know another small technical question. So since we are talking to the chief curator in the British collection, so how's your job description would look like? Because these are, there are university-based museums in Sri Lanka, And we have one, we have probably the oldest, and then we have, and then the several other universities has those. So this question comes sometimes, who is the curator and what is the curator's job? Does a curator requires need a PhD? Like what is the amount of research that curator should do? And how, what kind of as support staff that curator should get? And these are questions that our system kind of doesn't know, largely doesn't know to answer. So as the curator of the Natural History Museum of London, can you just tell us in a very technical way, broadly how your day would look like when you are in the collections, how many days you are expected in the collection, and what kind of duties you do, and what kind of duties the assistants do, in a very brief way, so that I think there are a few people here in the audience who are very interested about that, including Professor Preeti Udagama, who just spoke to you, our department head, because like people like them sometimes struggle to to recruit, and sometimes to maintain, and also to provide resources, because you don't know at times whether this is a reasonable request or not, and so on, right?
Yeah, I mean, so I think, the first thing to realize is that we're a pretty exceptional situation here at the NHM. Even in the UK, no other collection is as large or is as well staffed as we are. So for example, at the Liverpool Museum, which is also another national collection, much smaller, but they have one curator for vertebrates, all of vertebrates, and one curatorial assistant. For vertebrates, we have 18 curators at the NHM. So every institution is going to be different. And usually the smaller the museum, the wider that role is expected to cover. So for example, I don't deal with exhibitions and galleries. We have an entire team that does exhibitions and galleries. Whereas at a smaller museum, that might be an expected role. Ultimately, I don't think it's necessary to focus on specific qualifications like a PhD. It's the key with every museum collection is to leave it in a better state than when you found it, because it's a legacy, it's a biological archive. And we are just, as curators, we're just stewards of that collection, protecting it for generations to come. So we do our best to make sure that the things that we do with it and the things that we do to build it and look after it improve it over time in some way. So for me, I mean, I'm essentially a manager. I have a team of 6 curators who are, far brighter and more experienced than I am. They're the ones who are, more or less interacting with visitors, dealing with destructive sampling applications, recurating collections. I basically sit in my office and do email and make sure that they get the resources that they need from higher up in museum management. Smaller collections, you've got fewer people involved. If you've got a lot of material coming in, or the potential for a lot of material to come in, then preparation skills, preparing skins, eggs, spirits, skeletons could be quite important. But if it's a relatively, I don't want to say closed collection, but if you don't get a lot of new material or new donations, then those skills aren't necessarily what you would be after. You want people who, can care for historic objects and deal with research visitors. So ultimately depends on the nature of the collection, how it's used, how you want it to be used, and sort of the vision that you see for it going ahead. Those will all impact the sort of skills that you might need for somebody who would be called a curator, because that's such a catch-all term.
Yeah, thanks, Alex. I was a curator at the BT collection for mostly for birds and mammals. So I think your description is quite fitting in the American Canadian standards as well. BT is a medium-sized museum where your description is there. One thing we had there is that we had about 18 volunteers some were specialized on displays and interacting with kids and public. Some were at the back with the domestic collections and processing and skin preparations and all and so on. Yeah, but yeah, okay, thanks. But 18 curators, that's quite a resource at your position. Alex, thanks. And Alex, there's another chat a question in the chat. How do you select specimens for public display? At NHM, do you get the attention of the public through social media?
So specimens for display, usually that comes from the galleries and exhibitions team. So they have an idea, they want to do an exhibition on, I don't know, flight. So, you've got flies, bees, moths, flying fish, birds, obviously. So they'll come together and put together essentially their vision for what they want the exhibition to be. They'll bring that to us, and then we'll start to discuss what specimens we have that might be available. In terms of individual specimens, the decision whether it goes on exhibition depends on a couple of different things. One is its condition primarily. Is it suitable to be on public display for a long period of time, usually 6 to 12 months? A lot of the specimens won't be because they're old, they're very fragile. They may be broken. When they were collected, the bill might have been shot off, like that sort of thing. It may not be in the right position that they want. Usually for exhibitions, they want mounted specimens as opposed to skins. So specimens that are posed in a taxidermy sort of lifelike way. And it might not be the right pose. It might not be, they wanted a male and we only have a female, or they wanted a juvenile and we only have adults. So a lot of it is sort of filtered through what we have available. If they have budget, can we commission somebody to make us a new taxidermy mount? Because they're not cheap if you want to do them properly. Something like that goose over there, would probably cost about £400 for someone to prepare properly in a way that would be robust to exhibition and wouldn't fall apart within 2 or 3 years. So yeah, a whole variety of questions come to, how important is it scientifically, and is that necessary for the exhibition? Someone says we need finches from the Galapagos. Can we have one of Darwin's? Well, no. Unless it's an exhibition specifically about Darwin. If it's just an example of a finch from the Galapagos, we have others that are historically less valuable. So that always plays into our minds as well, is the intrinsic value of individual specimens. And the other question was about social media.
Yes. How you get attention of the public through social media? That was the question.
Yeah, so we've got, again, as the NHM is so massive, this is an entire other department. We have a whole digital team that do online content, videos, blogs, Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, any, social media, everything. So yeah, we tap into a whole variety of different social media platforms, but there's a whole other team that do that they only come to us when they need either something fact-checked, or if it's about something in particular that we've done, like a new publication or a new collection that we've received or something like that. So yeah, we don't have too much to do with them, I'm afraid.
Great. There's one. Is there any plans to digitize specimens as 3D models to make the collection more accessible to public?
Yeah, interesting. 3D models aren't, that's a really challenging one. First, there are no plans, I will say, because it's a very laborious process. It's very time consuming, very expensive, and to do 1 million objects just wouldn't be feasible. We've shied away from photographing particular specimens because birds are so well studied. If you want to see what a house sparrow looks like, you'll go to a field guide or another publication as opposed to look for museum specimens. And that might not be true for other groups, particularly in the invertebrates. So our focus on digitization has mostly been around capturing the basic metadata from labels, because our experience as well is we might photograph something, but someone will come along and say, oh, I really want to use your photographs, but they're not quite right. Could you just, photograph it a little bit differently? No, we can't be endlessly doing that. So, so for the bird collection, at least, our focus has been on just recording the basic level information of data, and leaving those who need, for a genuine research need, those image files, be they, surface scanning, 3D surface scanning, or CT scanning, or conventional photography, to arrange it separately.
Thanks. Yeah, in that light, some of the publications came from Sri Lanka. The first description of the European honey buzzard in Sri Lanka. Then now the one in the pipeline on Hanuman plover, and several such papers got these images from British collections in that standard format that Alex mentioned, and they are quite fast. Even during the pandemic, you were fast enough that it's relatively straightforward. Only thing, you need to first contact them and explain what you need, and then they are quite good at it, providing the needed facility. Especially the digitized versions are easier for them to handle like this, right? And then anyway, for specimens and tissues, we've been dealing with sometimes tissues from European collections. Getting from there is one thing, getting into Sri Lanka through our system is another whole level of complication. So it's not straightforward, but getting digital material from European collections are relatively straightforward. People are very friendly and helpful, and if they realize that you are genuine and you want that particular piece urgently and critically, they are happy to provide it in a timely manner. Yeah, in that light, Alex, the small question from me: what kind of laboratory facilities you have, especially attached to the tissue collection? Do you have your own, sequencers and your own system, molecular system in place, so that through collaborations that we could work with the natural history collection, or the researchers has to go through another university or another research institute in UK to so that they can loan or they can get the destructive sampling done and then work
Sure.
with,
So we have what's called the Imaging and Analysis Center. So if you look at that on the museum website, that covers all of our facilities. So that includes everything from all the geological preparation, side of things, right to molecular. So yeah, we do have a molecular lab with Illumina sequencing, shotgun sequencing. It's not bad. It's I think understaffed at the moment, so it's often quicker and sometimes cheaper to send material to collaborators elsewhere for molecular work. But we've got CT imaging, we've got 3D surface scanning, we've got a huge molecular facility, a whole bunch of chemical analysis tools available. So yeah, huge, X-ray, XRF. You name it. Either we have it or we will know somebody who does.
Yeah, and I think for the Eastern yellow wagtail paper, some of the researchers here, Gary actually visited your collection and got the needed photos and all. So yeah, so it's been even in the recent few years, it's been positively helping Sri Lankan ornithology as well.
Hello.
Oh, yes, go ahead, Sevandi.
I hope I'm audible. I have a general question to Dr. Alex. How is the public enthusiasm or the impression about the collection when you compare the pre-COVID and the post-COVID situation there?
Yeah, that's really interesting. So before COVID, we received in the public galleries about 5 million visitors a year. It's making us one of, if not the most visited indoor attraction in the UK. I think, so obviously we had restrictions on capacity during COVID that have only just been lifted fully about 3 or 4 months ago. And I think numbers are rapidly increasing. I think the demography of our visitors is changing quite a bit. It was before being in central London, we had a huge proportion of visitors who were from other countries internationally. Whereas now I think that has obviously decreased as countries still have, restrictions on travel and movement. And in particular, as the UK has implemented some, increased visa restrictions, particularly from folks in Europe. So it's still quite high. I'm not sure if it's close to 5 million yet. Again, a whole other department looks after that side of things. But yeah, it definitely took a hit, though it is coming back.
Just one small question, Alex. Vindhya is asking, are private collections still allowed in UK? If so, is there any regulation?
Oh, yeah. Gosh, that's such a tough one. So eggs is really challenging. So British people love collecting eggs for whatever reason. I don't really know. I'm not from Britain. But everyone who was born before about 1950 seemed to have a little collection of eggs in a shoebox under their bed. You haven't been allowed to collect eggs since 1954, and you haven't been allowed to possess eggs really since about 1981. And we still get quite a lot of donations of egg material, and it's legal to hold it as long as they can demonstrably prove that it was collected before 1954 or something along those lines. Private taxidermy is absolutely allowed. And yeah, I'm not aware of what regulations there are surrounding that. There will be presumably around importing taxidermy from abroad. Certainly there is. Or taxidermy that contains, so for example, elephant ivory or other CITES listed species will be affected in some way, but I'm afraid that's not an area where I know the answer. So yes, you can definitely have a stuffed bird in your house in the UK, which is very bizarre.
In Sri Lanka, theoretically you can't have anything, any biological material, wild animal origin thing in without a permit. That includes stuffed birds and all, eggs and. All right, I think we'll wrap the session. It's very interactive. Thank you, Alex. For that, I'll let Dr. Maheshi Mahapalagamage, three of us normally run the session. So Maheshi will do the formal thank you note. And before that, thank you very much, Alex, for accepting. I know you were traveling a bit lately, and but it's and as we discussed earlier, if you think of this part of the world, there's a free guide, a truck, and a house, and few lectures, mandatory lectures, and a seminar at the department. Right, over to you.
Thank you, sir. So thank you very much, Professor Alex Bond, Dr. Alex Bond, for that very informative and fruitful presentation, followed by this interactive discussion as well. And we learned a lot from you. And thanks a lot for accepting our invitation and for sharing your expertise, knowledge about this National History Museum, and also about its history and all fascinating information behind it, and for sharing your interesting research findings as well. So we highly appreciate your effort, Dr. Alex Bond. And I would like to thank Professor Sampath Seneviratne, who did a mammoth task behind organizing this event. And this event actually hosted by his own laboratory, that is Laboratory for Molecular Ecology and Evolution. So thank you, sir. And also thank you, sir, for letting us to meet these eminent personas, international personas. And I would like to thank Dr. Sachini Amarasekara for creating a wonderful flyer as always. And then I would like to thank Professor Preeti Udagama, who is the head of the Department of Zoology and Environmental Sciences, University of Colombo. So she's always keen on these events, and she's providing like immense support and guidance to us. So thanks a lot, madam. And we should not forget our strength, that is our audience. So thanks a lot for everyone for joining in and for like showing your enthusiasm as real scientists. And finally, thanks again, Dr. Alex, for taking your precious time to educate us. And we wish you all the very best in your journey in this park. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Take care.